The bowl cut of America's Little Brother was actually a uniform forcing Adam Rich into exhausting labor to feed an entire 1970s television network, only to be thrown to the streets like an expired prop the exact moment his voice cracked. The expensive lenses that once tracked his profitable smile were replaced by security cameras, recording an addict holding a brick to smash a pharmacy display case in the dead of night to steal medical narcotics. His fentanyl-flooded corpse removed from his home in 2023 was the actual completion of a slowly executed death sentence, exposing Hollywood's cold-blooded law, blatantly draining a child's youth and remaining completely unaccountable when they dropped dead on the streets. There was absolutely no internet infrastructure, completely zero digital streaming platforms, and absolutely no fragmented cable audiences. When a major, highly powerful broadcasting network aired a family sitcom, it actively captured the undivided attention of an entire massive country all at once. 8 is Enough was an absolute pillar of this massive cultural and financial broadcasting dominance. It actively presented a completely wholesome, highly comforting, entirely manufactured vision of the large American family unit. Millions of working-class civilians gathered entirely in their private living rooms every single week to watch this highly idealized, completely scripted life unfold, but entirely behind the warm, highly comforting artificial glow of the television screen, the physical reality was completely different. Network television was a completely unregulated, highly cynical, entirely industrial corporate machine. Child labor protections in the highly lucrative entertainment sector during this specific historical era were deeply flawed and completely filled with massive legal loopholes. The wealthy television studios absolutely did not view developing children as vulnerable human minors in need of basic parental guidance. They strictly, coldly viewed them entirely as heavily monetized, highly disposable corporate commodities required for weekly production. The consuming civilian public actively saw a heartwarming, deeply loving family dynamic projected directly onto their screens. On the highly restricted, heavily guarded studio lot, it was a high-stakes, completely ruthless corporate environment. Massive millions of untaxed corporate dollars hinged entirely and directly on the specific emotional performance of an 8-year-old biological boy. The powerful executives at the ABC network and Lorimar Productions absolutely did not treat Adam Rich as a growing, developing human child. To the highly paid corporate executives and network shareholders, he was strictly raw, highly exploitable material. He was an absolutely vital, highly functional mechanical tool directly required to meet their massive daily production schedules. When the massive television network mathematically realized that their highly lucrative Nielsen ratings among female and younger demographics were skyrocketing, they acted. They recognized this massive financial surge was specifically entirely because of Adam's screen presence, and they made a swift, highly calculated corporate decision. The highly paid adult writers completely systematically overhauled the entire television script structure. They aggressively shifted the massive narrative weight of the entire television show directly onto the absolute youngest son of the ensemble cast. They actively, forcefully required an 8-year-old child to completely carry the massive financial responsibility and strict rating success for a massive network series. California state law technically, officially stated that a working child actor's physical day was legally limited to exactly 9.5 hours. This specific, highly strict legal limit was officially required by the state to completely include their basic educational schooling and their necessary physical rest periods. The massive corporate studio aggressively bypassed this fundamental labor regulation with complete, cold, calculated industrial efficiency. They actively, highly successfully employed a massive legal loophole by strictly only logging the highly specific metric known as rolling time. This completely deceptive accounting meant they only officially recorded the exact physical minutes the massive studio camera was actively recording a scene. The highly exhausting, completely draining sunk time occurring between camera setups was completely, deliberately ignored by the highly paid adult producers. Endless physical hours spent sitting completely immobile directly in the highly restrictive makeup chair absolutely did not legally count toward his limit. Standing perfectly, completely still directly on taped floor marks, while adult technicians aggressively adjusted complex, highly dangerous lighting rigs, did not count. Actively memorizing highly complex adult dialogue lines at home late at night under severe psychological pressure did not legally count as labor. Because of this completely brutal, highly manipulative corporate accounting, Adam's actual physical working hours routinely severely stretched beyond the legal framework. He was highly frequently physically forced to work completely exhausting 10 or 12-hour physical days on the active sound stage. He was easily, entirely legally working exactly 60 continuous hours, a single week strictly as an elementary schooler. His highly small developing biological body was systematically subjected directly to grueling, highly punishing physical conditions every single production day. He actively physically worked constantly directly under the incredibly intense, highly oppressive physical heat of massive halogen and tungsten studio lights. These completely primitive, massive lighting fixtures actively baked the entirely enclosed sound stages to highly dangerous physical temperatures. The ambient physical temperature on the active set routinely reached an incredibly highly oppressive 37 or completely sweltering 40 degrees Celsius. His developing human skin was completely, aggressively suffocated by heavy, entirely chemical-laden theatrical cosmetics required for the camera lenses. These specific daily cosmetics actively contained highly dangerous heavy metals and industrial talc. They highly effectively clogged his natural biological pores entirely for thousands of continuous physical hours during his absolute most formative physiological years. The state law also strictly mandated exactly 3 continuous hours of basic educational schooling per physical day, specifically for working child actors. The massive corporate studio highly cynically complied entirely on physical paper by actively hiring specific on-set studio teachers. However, the massive production company completely controlled and actively paid the financial salaries of these specific adult teachers. This highly deliberate financial structure actively created an immediate, entirely obvious, and completely corrupt conflict of professional interest. Adam's required basic education was absolutely not a safe place of actual human learning or functional intellectual development. It was a completely fragmented, highly chaotic, entirely strictly legal necessity required to avoid state corporate fines. His highly necessary foundational schooling was aggressively sliced directly into completely useless 15 to 20-minute physical intervals. These incredibly brief educational bursts were aggressively squeezed in directly amidst the completely deafening noise and highly severe stress of an active television set, completely more highly damaging than the massive, entirely irreversible academic deficit was the absolute social starvation he endured. Adam was tightly, completely, legally locked strictly inside a highly sterile, entirely adult-dominated physical bubble. He was entirely, completely stripped of the fundamental biological opportunity to actively interact with standard civilian peers his own exact age. He absolutely never naturally learned exactly how to communicate normally with other human children in completely unscripted physical environments. He completely failed to learn exactly how to successfully, highly naturally resolve standard, everyday childhood conflicts without adult intervention. To aggressively extract the highly specific, incredibly lucrative emotional performance, adult directors routinely utilized intense, severe psychological pressure. They completely did not hesitate to aggressively yell or entirely threaten the highly vulnerable young child directly on the set. They executed this toxic psychological abuse strictly to instantly induce highly specific physical tears or completely manufactured laughter directly on command. They entirely coldly treated his completely genuine human biological emotions exactly like a highly trained, entirely mechanical Pavlovian response. This completely relentless, highly daily psychological manipulation severely, entirely permanently wore down his completely developing central nervous system. The massive Hollywood corporate structure explicitly, completely legally forbade him from actively showing absolutely any negative human emotions in civilian public. Even completely on his supposedly highly protected physical days off, he was actively forced directly into relentless, highly exhausting promotional tours. He was actively, strictly commanded to entirely inhabit the highly cheerful, completely carefree physical persona of Nicholas 24, continuous hours a day. Psychologically, this completely relentless, highly artificial daily performance induced a highly severe case of clinical identity diffusion. When the massive, highly expensive studio cameras finally completely stopped physically rolling and the adult directors went home, the psychological void was absolute. The highly exhausted, completely drained young boy had absolutely no genuine idea exactly who Adam actually physically was. There is a highly persistent, completely manufactured cultural myth actively perpetuated by the massive corporate media. It dictates that all highly recognized child stars are instantly, completely minted financial millionaires who are set securely for their entire natural life. The highly documented, entirely undeniable physical reality of Adam's completely extracted situation tells a much darker, completely unvarnished historical story. The massive financial architecture of Hollywood was meticulously, completely legally designed to actively siphon massive wealth directly away from its youngest laborers. This massive, highly systematic financial extraction was executed with complete, absolute, and entirely airtight corporate legality. The highly publicized Coogan Act, which was originally theoretically designed to completely protect child actors, was entirely, woefully inadequate during Adam's era. Operating entirely in the late 1970s, the deeply flawed state law only legally mandated a completely pathetic fraction. It strictly required that a mere 15% of a highly vulnerable child's massive gross earnings be securely placed into a protected trust over the highly agonizing physical years, even this incredibly highly meager, completely insufficient financial sum was severely eroded by standard economic inflation. The staggering, completely massive remaining 85% of his gross corporate income was highly ruthlessly, completely legally butchered. It was actively drained by the highly motivated surrounding adults and massive, highly predatory corporate entities. Federal and state income taxes aggressively legally claimed up to 50% of his massive, untaxed physical earnings. Powerful corporate talent agents actively, completely legally, took their highly standard 10% financial cut directly off the physical top. Highly motivated talent managers aggressively legally took another massive 15% directly from his generated wealth. Whatever highly small, entirely fractional physical remainder actually actively existed was often completely, entirely, legally absorbed directly by his biological family. The massive generated money was aggressively utilized strictly to entirely maintain a highly specific, completely elevated physical lifestyle. This highly expensive, entirely artificial standard of civilian living was actively dictated strictly by the intense expectations of the massive entertainment industry. The completely natural, highly necessary biological family dynamic was entirely, completely, permanently, physically inverted. An entirely, highly vulnerable 8-year-old biological boy was actively, physically carrying the heavy, massive economic survival of 5 to 7 grown adult humans directly on his small back. Adam's highly recognizable, incredibly lucrative, iconic visual image featured a highly specific trademark bowl cut. This specific visual image was aggressively, entirely legally stamped directly onto massive millions of physical metal lunchboxes, physical cotton t-shirts, and highly glossy retail magazines. This massive, entirely unregulated global merchandise aggressively generated massive, highly untaxed corporate profits. Yet, the massive, highly powerful corporate studio expertly, completely legally circumvented fundamental copyright law. They actively executed a highly specific, entirely legal sleight of hand by actively licensing the specific intellectual rights completely to the fictional character of Nicholas. They strictly, entirely avoided licensing the actual, completely physical human biological likeness of Adam Rich. This completely cold, highly calculated legal corporate maneuver entirely, permanently stripped Adam of his highly lucrative personal merchandising royalties. He physically, entirely, completely saw absolutely nothing from the massive, highly lucrative global secondary retail market his own physical face actively created. Furthermore, his highly necessary syndication residuals were severely, entirely, completely artificially capped by highly standard union contracts of the exact historical era. The physical money he actually earned when the massive television show was actively rerun quickly, mathematically plummeted to absolute zero. He legally received absolutely nothing, even as the massive ABC network continued to aggressively earn hundreds of millions of untaxed corporate dollars. They actively, highly successfully generated this massive wealth completely from broadcasting those exact same physical episodes directly around the globe, entirely for decades. In the specific calendar year of 1981, when Adam was physically strictly 13 years old, the situation abruptly ended. The massive, highly profitable network television series 8 is Enough was completely, officially, legally canceled by the corporate executives. Simultaneously, highly unstoppable human biology completely took its natural, highly unavoidable physical course within his developing body. Adam's entirely physical, biological voice began to naturally, highly healthily break and audibly deepen. He naturally experienced sudden, highly awkward biological growth spurts typical of a developing teenage human male. His highly scrutinized physical human face inevitably, entirely, completely, naturally broke out in standard teenage biological acne. The massive Hollywood corporate machine had actively valued his physical body entirely and exclusively on a highly specific metric. They completely legally valued his biology strictly on what the wealthy corporate executives entirely internally labeled cute equity. His completely natural, entirely unavoidable physiological human development was absolutely not actively seen as a human child simply healthily growing up. It was coldly, highly strictly viewed entirely by the massive network executives strictly as a highly critical, entirely, completely unacceptable physical product defect. Once he completely, absolutely no longer physically looked exactly like the cherubic, entirely, completely unthreatening little boy the highly consuming public adored, the reaction was swift. The industry completely discarded him without a single necessary psychological transition package or career safety net. The completely sudden, highly absolute physical cancellation of the massive television series triggered an immediate, highly catastrophic biological and psychological collapse. Adam Rich was physically strictly 13 years old when the highly wealthy corporate executives completely, entirely, permanently discarded his biological body. There was absolutely no highly necessary, completely professional psychological transition package actively offered by the massive television network. There was entirely zero specialized, highly necessary career counseling actively provided by the heavily funded corporate human resources department. There was absolutely no social, financial, or medical safety net actively waiting to completely catch his highly vulnerable developing physical body. The highly powerful casting directors completely, entirely, flatly, physically refused to actively give him new, highly mature adult acting roles. They actively, aggressively claimed the highly consuming civilian audiences would absolutely only ever physically see him as the highly recognizable little brother. His highly desperate, entirely continuous physical attempts to actively transition directly into older, more serious adult roles were met with complete failure. A highly specific new network television series called Code Red was abruptly, completely, legally canceled after strictly 13 physical episodes. He was highly, rapidly, completely, aggressively downgraded entirely to completely invisible, highly fractional voice acting work. He actively took a highly minor, completely hidden physical role in the Dungeons & Dragons animated television series strictly to secure basic civilian income. Eventually, he completely exclusively received highly mocking, entirely self-referential cameo television appearances that actively capitalized entirely on his past childhood fame. By the late 1980s, the massive, highly lucrative corporate studio system had entirely, completely erased his physical existence from their massive corporate ledgers, thrust completely directly into the entirely foreign, highly chaotic physical environment of Chatsworth High School. The severe biological damage was exposed. Adam's massive, entirely completely corporate-mandated educational gaps actively left him entirely behind his civilian peers academically. The massive physical school hallways were incredibly loud, completely highly confusing, and completely socially unforgiving for his highly isolated biology. The highly public, entirely unvarnished civilian label of actively being a completely washed-up television actor made him a highly specific physical target. He immediately became the absolute prime target for highly severe physical bullying and completely relentless, entirely daily social isolation. He was aggressively mocked entirely for a highly specific childhood he absolutely never actually got to physically experience. Suffering completely from a highly acute, entirely severe crisis of personal confidence and deep, completely untreated psychological distress, the academic system failed. Adam officially, completely, legally dropped out of the physical high school entirely between the highly vulnerable biological ages of 14 and 17. He completely, entirely, permanently lost his absolute final, highly desperate physical opportunity to successfully integrate directly into normal civil society. Completely, entirely stripped of his fundamental human identity, entirely legally unemployed, and actively suffering from severe, completely untreated clinical depression, the reaction was physical. Adam absolutely did not actively turn directly to heavy chemical narcotics strictly for standard civilian recreation or social partying. He actively, entirely, desperately turned directly to them strictly as a highly necessary, entirely physical mechanism of completely desperate self-medication. He was highly, actively, completely, desperately trying to physically, chemically anesthetize his severe, entirely untreated daily psychological agony. His severe, entirely complete chemical escalation actively followed a highly grim, completely medically predictable biological sequence. Between the highly vulnerable physical ages of 14 and 16, he relied completely heavily on marijuana and highly toxic liquid alcohol. He actively utilized these highly accessible chemical substances strictly to physically soothe his crushing, highly severe biological insomnia. He actively required the heavy chemical sedation to completely quiet the overwhelming daily anxiety actively generated by years of onset hypervigilance. By the specific physical time he was actively 17 to 20 years old, the chemical tolerance had entirely severely progressed. He actively biologically progressed directly to highly illegal, extremely potent chemical cocaine to actively alter his highly damaged central nervous system. He was entirely, highly desperately trying to artificially, chemically manufacture the necessary biological dopamine his brain desperately required. He was completely attempting to chemically replace the lost human confidence that the massive Hollywood corporate machine had forcefully, entirely drained directly from him. Ultimately, his highly exhausted, completely damaged biology became entirely physically dependent directly on heavy medical sedatives. He actively, heavily relied entirely on highly regulated chemicals, specifically like Valium, and completely powerful, highly dangerous prescription opioids. He utilized these highly lethal, extremely potent narcotics strictly to physically cope directly with entirely crippling, completely severe daily paranoia. The highly prolonged, entirely heavy chemical abuse completely, entirely, permanently, physically altered his biological brain's highly delicate physical architecture. He actively, completely plunged deep into a highly severe, entirely, completely treatment-resistant state of profound clinical depression. He was entirely, completely, physically trapped directly inside a highly severe biochemical prison, entirely of his own active making. By the specific calendar year of 1991, exactly at the physical age of 22, the financial reality completely collapsed. The entirely highly meager, completely fractional remaining funds strictly located inside Adam's highly protected Coogan Trust were completely, entirely exhausted. His highly addicted, entirely, completely dependent physical body was actively trapped directly in the excruciating, highly severe physical grip of chemical withdrawal. This specific calendar year actively marked the highly tragic, completely undeniable historical threshold of his physical life. It completely marked the exact physical moment where his entirely private chemical substance abuse actively mutated directly into highly public criminal desperation. In the highly early, completely dark physical hours of a highly cold April morning, the severe biological withdrawal completely dictated his physical actions. Adam actively took a highly heavy, completely solid metal tire iron directly into his trembling physical hands. He aggressively, violently smashed the heavy steel tool right entirely through the thick physical glass doors of a standard civilian pharmacy. This highly specific, entirely, completely documented physical crime occurred directly in West Hills, highly located entirely within Los Angeles. Driven completely by the entirely terrifying, highly blinding physical tunnel vision of severe, highly agonizing physical chemical withdrawal, he acted specifically. He bypassed the highly visible cash register entirely. The money meant absolutely nothing to him in that moment. His only desperate target was the locked steel cabinets in the back of the store, where the heavy prescription opioids were kept out of reach. He actively targeted the highly specific cabinets entirely containing incredibly potent, highly regulated prescription opioid chemical painkillers. He was physically caught completely red-handed directly inside the highly damaged physical store entirely by the actively responding Los Angeles Police Department. The highly sheer, completely undeniable biological depth of his severe physiological dependence was actively confirmed just highly specific months later. In the specific calendar month of October of exactly 1991, a highly severe, entirely undeniable secondary physical incident occurred. He was currently actively out of physical jail, entirely on highly expensive bail, and actively receiving highly necessary medical treatment. He was physically located inside a highly sterile local civilian hospital, specifically for a highly painful, entirely, completely dislocated physical shoulder. While physically located directly inside the completely secure medical facility, his highly severe biological addiction completely overrode entirely all logical thought. He was actively, physically caught completely, entirely stealing a highly loaded physical syringe full of strong chemical painkillers. He actively attempted to steal the highly regulated medical narcotics directly from the highly trained physical hospital medical staff. His highly unvarnished, completely highly public police mugshot entirely, completely, highly successfully shocked the highly consuming American civilian public. It visibly, entirely, undeniably, physically showed a highly haggard, completely desperate young human man actively enduring severe physical agony. He visibly, physically looked absolutely nothing completely like the highly pristine, incredibly wholesome human child the television audience actively remembered. The highly aggressive, completely unregulated corporate tabloid press actively, highly eagerly descended immediately upon his entirely visible physical misery. They aggressively, entirely legally exploited his highly severe physical and biological collapse strictly to actively sell incredibly cheap, highly profitable magazines. Meanwhile, the massive television network ABC and the highly wealthy corporate studios completely, entirely, coldly maintained an absolute distance. The exact same massive corporate entities that had successfully made entirely massive millions of dollars entirely off his highly vulnerable childhood strictly maintained a completely cold, absolute, total corporate silence. The absolute, entirely only single physical person directly from his highly manufactured corporate past who actually stepped forward was highly specific. It was entirely the working human actor Dick Van Patten, the specific man who had highly actively played his fictional television father. Van Patten actively, personally, physically paid the highly specific $5,000 physical dollar legal bail directly to the state courts. He executed this financial transaction strictly to actively, physically get Adam completely out of the highly dangerous, entirely, completely unforgiving county jail. Recognizing the highly deep, entirely, completely undeniable medical pathology actively operating directly behind his highly desperate criminal physical actions, the courts acted. The highly strict presiding state courts actively accepted a completely medically based, entirely highly specific legal defense strategy. Adam formally, legally pleaded absolutely no contest directly to the highly severe, entirely, completely documented criminal felony charges. He was legally given exactly 5 continuous physical years of highly strict, entirely, completely monitored state probation. This legal sentence was actively, entirely executed with the highly specific, entirely, completely strict legal condition regarding his biology. He was legally, entirely, mandatorily required to completely, successfully finish a highly strict, entirely closed medical rehabilitation program. He was actively, entirely sent directly to the highly secure Betty Ford Center, entirely, instead of physically going directly to highly dangerous state prison. This highly publicized, incredibly highly tragic physical arc officially, entirely, completely cemented a highly specific, entirely, completely toxic cultural trope. It actively, completely, successfully drove the entirely, completely manufactured concept of the child star curse deeply into the highly consuming American consciousness. The completely manufactured, entirely, highly convenient cultural narrative of a mystical Hollywood curse actively requires immediate, completely clinical forensic dismantling. For highly continuous, entirely, completely profitable decades, the massive mainstream corporate media actively, highly successfully placed the severe physical blame. They strictly, entirely, completely placed the massive historical blame directly and squarely upon the highly vulnerable child stars themselves. They aggressively, entirely legally branded these highly traumatized young human actors strictly as completely reckless, entirely ungrateful, or highly morally weak individuals. The highly wealthy, entirely, completely shielded corporate executives actively utilize their massive public relations machinery to completely enforce this specific narrative. They actively, entirely, completely push the highly false narrative that these severely damaged human beings had simply, entirely willfully squandered their massive privilege. Some highly paid, entirely completely corporate-aligned media commentators aggressively argued a slightly different, completely, entirely, highly convenient alternative narrative. They actively argued that the highly desperate civilian parents were the entirely true, completely absolute historical villains of the physical tragedy. They actively claimed the adult guardians willfully, completely, entirely blinded themselves directly to the severe, completely permanent psychological damage. They supposedly executed this severe biological ignorance entirely, strictly for the highly lucrative sake of a massive, entirely untaxed corporate paycheck. However, modern, entirely, completely, highly rigorous historical interpretation completely, entirely, forcefully shifts the massive analytical focus. It aggressively, highly, completely shifts the focus directly onto the entirely systemic, completely physical nature of the massive corporate abuse. The highly specific, entirely, completely documented legal frameworks actively operating directly within the 1970s and 80s were explicitly, highly mathematically designed. They were entirely, completely, strictly designed exclusively to actively protect massive, highly lucrative corporate profits. They were absolutely, entirely, completely not designed to actively, physically protect highly vulnerable, completely developing human children from severe biological extraction. By entirely, completely framing these highly predictable, entirely, completely tragic physical outcomes merely as severe personal moral failures, the system won. By actively categorizing the severe biological destruction strictly as a completely mystical, highly unexplainable curse, the massive entertainment industry succeeded entirely. They entirely, highly, completely successfully deflected absolutely all historical and completely legal responsibility away from their massive corporate ledgers. They entirely, completely avoided any strict, highly necessary historical accountability for actively, deliberately building a massive, highly lucrative business model. This massive corporate model completely, fundamentally relied directly on the ruthless, highly efficient exploitation and subsequent physical discarding of vulnerable human minors. Adam physically spent the completely subsequent 30 physical years actively living largely in highly severe, completely entire physical isolation. He lived completely entirely away from the highly scrutinizing, entirely completely unforgiving public eye of the massive corporate media. Despite completely entirely highly documented moments of severe physical clarity and completely brief, highly temporary periods of chemical sobriety, the biology remained damaged. The highly severe, entirely, completely physical damage actively inflicted directly upon his biological brain's delicate reward centers was completely, absolutely permanent. A highly publicized, entirely, completely documented physical arrest actively occurred entirely in the specific calendar year of 2002. He was actively physically arrested by local civilian law enforcement, strictly for aggressively driving completely under the severe physical influence of chemicals. During this highly specific, entirely, completely terrifying physical incident, his civilian vehicle actively, nearly physically collided directly with a marked police cruiser. This completely undeniable physical reality actively proved that his severe, completely internal biological battle was entirely, completely far from physically over. The highly agonizing, completely entirely internal biological war actively continued to entirely completely ravage his highly exhausted central nervous system. On the exact calendar date of January 7th, entirely in the specific calendar year of 2023, the final event occurred. Adam Rich was discovered dead inside his private home in the Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. His body, severely damaged by years of substance reliance, had finally given out. At exactly 54 years old, the toll of his childhood fame and the subsequent decades of isolation had culminated in a silent, irreversible end. Actively responding civilian police officers and highly trained medical paramedics quickly, entirely, completely, legally ruled out any highly specific physical foul play. They also completely, entirely, highly, clinically ruled out any specific physical evidence of active, intentional biological suicide directly at the physical scene. The highly specific, completely, entirely legal medical investigation was actively, entirely, completely handed directly over to the county medical examiner. In the specific calendar month of June, entirely in the calendar year of 2023, the official results arrived. The official toxicology report provided the grim, undeniable final chapter of his story. It detailed with clinical precision exactly how his exhausted system finally succumbed to decades of severe chemical reliance, shutting down entirely after years of fighting an unwinnable war against his own nervous system. The completely official, entirely completely legal medical cause of physical death was strictly, entirely officially listed as severe fentanyl toxicity. This incredibly highly potent, entirely completely synthetic chemical opioid had actively, aggressively infiltrated his highly compromised biological bloodstream. It completely, entirely mathematically suppressed his highly necessary central respiratory system, entirely, completely halting his fundamental physical ability to breathe oxygen. This completely induced highly severe, entirely, completely fatal biological tissue hypoxia directly within his highly delicate internal human organs. The massive, entirely, completely severe biological lack of highly necessary physical oxygen ultimately, entirely, completely, directly led to a catastrophic event. It actively triggered a completely fatal, entirely, highly irreversible physical cardiac arrest entirely within his severely exhausted biological heart. While highly minor, entirely, completely fractional physical traces of the regulated chemical sedative lorazepam and liquid alcohol were physically present, the reality was clear. The highly trained medical examiner strictly, entirely, completely, clinically noted they were entirely at completely non-toxic, highly fractional biological levels. They were absolutely, entirely, completely not the highly direct physical chemical agents that actively, biologically caused his completely permanent physical death. The severe biological expiration was officially, entirely, completely, legally ruled strictly as a completely accidental, highly unintentional chemical physical overdose. He was quietly cremated far away from the glaring lenses of the corporate media that had once consumed his every move. The man was gone, leaving behind only a stark medical record and an uncomfortable legacy that forces the industry to confront its own brutal history. The completely, entirely, highly unvarnished physical story of Adam Rich strictly serves as a completely stark, highly uncomfortable historical mirror. It completely, actively, highly deeply reflects the completely true, entirely physical human biological cost of massive, entirely unregulated commercial corporate entertainment. It highly, actively, completely, deeply challenges the modern civilian viewer to entirely, completely recognize their own massive, highly undeniable historical complicity. The civilian public actively continues to completely, entirely, highly, willingly consume massive corporate media that actively treats developing human children as highly disposable commodities, while highly specific, entirely, completely modern civilian labor laws have actively, completely, incrementally, physically improved strictly since the late 1970s. A threat remains. The highly intense, completely, entirely severe psychological toll of actively thrusting highly vulnerable human children directly into global fame continues, forcing completely developing human central nervous systems into the entirely highly unnatural, completely physically severe crucible of massive public scrutiny remains devastating. This highly severe, entirely, completely physical biological issue remains a highly, completely, entirely relevant, highly dangerous physical reality actively today. This completely severe, highly, entirely undeniable physical reality is completely, entirely, especially true within our highly current modern digital era. We are actively, completely, entirely, currently existing directly within a highly unregulated, entirely, completely massive digital era of civilian social media family vloggers. Completely, highly vulnerable human children are actively, entirely, highly, heavily sponsored and completely physically monetized as entirely massive internet corporate influencers. The highly specific, entirely, completely physical delivery mechanisms of massive corporate exploitation have actively, entirely, completely evolved highly, rapidly, directly with digital technology. However, the completely underlying, entirely, highly severe biological danger of actively, entirely, completely, legally trading a human child's foundational physiological years remains. Aggressively extracting a completely, highly vulnerable child's entirely developing biology strictly for massive, completely unregulated financial corporate profit remains entirely intact. The highly specific, entirely, completely physical biological death of Adam Rich directly at the exact physical age of 54 was absolutely not an anomaly. It was completely, entirely, absolutely not a highly sudden, entirely, completely unpredictable physical tragedy that actively happened directly within a completely isolated vacuum. It was the entirely, highly, completely delayed physical execution of a severe, entirely, completely, highly unvarnished corporate sentence. This specific, completely, highly lethal physical sentence had been actively, entirely, completely, legally written directly into his physical life exactly 46 years earlier. The massive, entirely, completely, highly unregulated entertainment industry actively took a highly vibrant, completely developing 8-year-old biological human boy. They aggressively, entirely, completely, forcefully, physically turned his highly vulnerable biology directly into a completely relentless, entirely, highly efficient money-making industrial machine. They actively, entirely, completely, highly exhausted his completely, highly developing biological mind through completely severe, entirely daily psychological and physical corporate pressure. They actively, completely, highly, legally stripped him entirely of his massive generated financial wealth and completely destroyed his fundamental human identity. And then they entirely, completely, highly, coldly aggressively threw his highly exhausted physical body completely away into the highly unforgiving civilian street. They executed this highly severe physical abandonment, the exact, entirely, completely specific physical moment his highly biological physical product entirely expired. His highly agonizing, entirely, completely physically documented decades of highly severe, completely irreversible medical chemical addiction are absolute physical proof. The highly desperate, entirely, completely terrifying, shattered physical glass of a Los Angeles civilian pharmacy directly in 1991 is strict forensic evidence. His completely, entirely, highly final, entirely, completely desperate physical breath, entirely under the highly crushing biological weight of fentanyl in 2023, is conclusive. These highly severe, entirely, completely physical realities are absolutely, entirely, completely not the highly manufactured symptoms of a completely, highly fictional Hollywood curse. They are the entirely, completely bloody, highly undeniable, completely, entirely, strictly unvarnished physical forensic evidence of a highly brutal, completely industrialized biological exploitation. It is a massive, entirely, completely, highly unregulated corporate system where completely glittering, highly, entirely massive, multi-billion-dollar corporate empires are built. They are actively, entirely, completely, aggressively constructed directly, entirely, completely, strictly upon the permanent, highly irreversible physical, biological destruction of a vulnerable child's entire physical life.